Elijah Carmichael's fire had been dead for 8 hours when he woke on a January morning to find his cabin still warm enough to walk around in his shirt sleeves. Outside, the temperature sat at 11 degrees below zero. 50 yards away, smoke poured from his neighbor's chimney's fires that had burned continuously through the night, yet their cabins remained barely above freezing. Elijah's cabin, with its absurdly thick roof that everyone called a waste of time and timber, stayed 25 degrees warmer than theirs, without a single ember glowing in the hearth. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more unbelievable survival innovation from the American frontier. The year was 1842. The Appalachian settlement of Clear Creek Valley held 11 families scattered across 3 miles of mountain terrain in what would later become eastern Kentucky. They were farmers, trappers, and timber cutters who had moved west from Virginia and the Carolinas, seeking land and independence. Life was hard but manageable. Winters were brutal but survivable. Until the night of February 9th, when Daniel Carmichael died in his sleep less than 20 feet from a cold fireplace. Daniel was 31 years old. He had survived 6 winters in the mountains. He was careful, competent, and well prepared. His cabin was typical of frontier construction. Logs notched at corners, mud chinked between gaps, a stone fireplace on one wall, a single door, 2 small windows covered with oiled paper. The structure kept out wind and rain. It provided shelter. But on the night of February 9th, it failed to provide the one thing Daniel needed most: warmth. The temperature had dropped steadily throughout the evening. By midnight, it reached 8 degrees below zero. Daniel had kept his fire burning until around 10 in the evening, then banked the coals and went to sleep. His wife Abigail and their 2 children, ages 6 and 4, slept in the small loft above. The cabin was warm when they settled in for the night, perhaps 45 degrees, cold but survivable under heavy blankets. Sometime around 2 in the morning, the banked coals died completely. The cabin had no insulation beyond the single layer of logs forming the walls. The roof was simple: poles laid across the top wall logs, covered with bark and a thin layer of sod. Heat escaped through every gap in the chinking, through the thin roof, around the door frame. Within 30 minutes of the fire dying, the interior temperature began dropping rapidly. By 4 in the morning, the cabin interior had reached 20 degrees. By 6, it was 15 degrees. The cold was severe enough to kill. Daniel, exhausted from a full day of timber cutting, never woke. His body simply stopped functioning as his core temperature dropped below sustainable levels. Abigail and the children survived only because the loft retained slightly more heat than the main floor, and because they were smaller bodies generating warmth under shared blankets. Elijah Carmichael found his brother at dawn. He had walked over from his own cabin half a mile away to help Daniel with a timber project they had planned. He knocked on the door. No answer. He pushed it open and immediately felt the cold. The interior was barely warmer than outside. He saw Daniel's body on the sleeping platform, saw Abigail crying in the loft with the children, and understood what had happened. They buried Daniel 2 days later on a hillside overlooking the creek. Elijah stood at the grave long after everyone else had returned to their cabins. He was Daniel's older brother by 4 years. He had convinced Daniel to move west to the mountains. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming, but beneath the guilt was something else, a realization that would consume him for the next 8 months. Elijah Carmichael could not sleep after his brother's funeral. He lay in his own cabin at night, aware of every sound the fire made, conscious of the exact temperature around him, calculating how quickly warmth would disappear if the flames died. His cabin was identical in construction to Daniel's: the same notched logs, the same thin roof, the same vulnerability. The only difference was that Elijah had woken in time to feed his fire. Daniel had not. The first week after the burial, Elijah began measuring. He used a simple alcohol thermometer he had purchased 2 years earlier for monitoring his root cellar. He placed it in different locations around his cabin and recorded temperatures at different times of day. With the fire burning steadily, his cabin reached 60 degrees near the hearth, 45 degrees near the walls. When he let the fire die at night and checked the thermometer every hour, he watched the temperature drop. 1 hour after the fire died, 40 degrees. 2 hours, 32 degrees. 3 hours, 25 degrees. By dawn, 6 hours after the fire went out, his cabin was 18 degrees inside while the exterior temperature was 12 degrees. His cabin was only 6 degrees warmer than the outside air. That 6-degree difference was essentially meaningless. It was not enough to sustain life. It was not enough to prevent frostbite. It was barely enough to keep water from freezing. Elijah realized that frontier cabins were not warm structures. They were thin shells that temporarily trapped heat from fires but offered almost no actual insulation. He visited Robert Hutchins, his nearest neighbor, and asked questions that made Robert uncomfortable. "How often do you wake at night to feed your fire?" Robert admitted he woke every 2 to 3 hours throughout winter. "How much firewood do you burn in a season?" Robert estimated 2 full cords, maybe 2.5. "Have you ever let your fire go out accidentally?" "Yes, twice." Both times his family had woken, freezing, and had to rebuild the fire immediately while huddled under every blanket they owned. Elijah visited 3 other families and heard identical stories. Everyone burned fires continuously from November through March. Everyone woke multiple times each night. Everyone lived in a state of low-level anxiety about the fire dying. Everyone burned enormous quantities of wood just to maintain barely survivable temperatures. And everyone accepted this as normal, as the unavoidable reality of mountain life. But Elijah could not accept it. He had watched his brother die because of it. He had seen Abigail become a widow because of it. He had seen 2 children lose their father because a fire went out in a cabin that could not hold heat. The problem was clear. Cabins were built to keep out weather, not to retain warmth. The solution was equally clear, though no one had attempted it. Build a cabin that could hold heat long enough to survive a dead fire. Over the next month, Elijah's focus shifted from grief to methodology. He stopped thinking about Daniel's death as a tragic accident and started thinking about it as an engineering failure. The cabin had failed. The construction methods everyone used had failed. If different construction methods could succeed, then Daniel's death would mean something. It would become the reason other families survived. Spring arrived in Clear Creek Valley in late March of 1842. Snow melted. Creeks ran high with runoff. Families emerged from their cabins to begin planting and clearing land. Elijah Carmichael spent the spring studying anything that stayed warm. He started with his root cellar. Most families had dug root cellars for storing vegetables through winter. Elijah's was 6 feet deep, carved into a hillside, with a thick wooden door. He had always known the cellar stayed cool in summer and prevented vegetables from freezing in winter, but he had never thought carefully about why. Now he paid attention. He took his thermometer into the cellar during a cold snap in early April when exterior temperatures dropped to 28 degrees overnight. The cellar stayed at 52 degrees. The earth itself was holding heat, insulating the space from temperature swings outside. He examined a beaver lodge on the creek near his cabin. The structure was massive, perhaps 6 feet tall and 8 feet across, built from mud and sticks plastered together into a dense mass. Elijah knew beavers lived inside through winter. He broke off a piece of the outer shell and felt its thickness. The wall was nearly 18 inches of compressed material. He understood the principle. The beavers had built insulation around themselves, using available materials layered thick enough to trap their body heat inside. In May, Elijah hiked 3 miles to visit a limestone cave he had discovered the previous year. The cave entrance was small, but the interior opened into a chamber roughly 15 feet across. He brought his thermometer and spent an afternoon taking measurements. Outside temperature, 68 degrees. Cave interior temperature, 51 degrees. The cave stayed cool in summer, but Elijah knew from previous visits that it stayed relatively warm in winter. The massive stones surrounding the chamber acted as thermal mass, moderating temperature regardless of exterior conditions. He talked to Henry Dalton, a trapper in his 60s who had lived in a Norwegian settlement before coming to Kentucky. Henry described sod houses built by Scandinavian immigrants in the Northern Territories. The roofs were 3 feet thick, built from layers of earth and grass. The walls were stone or thick timber. Henry said those houses stayed warm with minimal fire because the mass of the structure held heat. A small fire in the evening would keep the house comfortable until morning. Elijah began to see a pattern. Everything that held heat effectively had one thing in common: mass. The root cellar had earth surrounding it. The beaver lodge had thick walls of dense material. The cave had stone. The sod houses had multiple feet of earth and sod. Mass absorbed heat when available and released it slowly over time. Mass created a buffer between interior and exterior temperatures. Standard frontier cabins had almost no mass. They were single-layer log walls with thin roofs. They were designed for speed of construction and weather protection, not thermal performance. Elijah realized that to solve the heating problem, he would need to build mass into his cabin. Specifically, he would need to build it into the roof, where heat naturally rose and escaped. Summer of 1842 brought long days and the opportunity to build. Elijah announced his intention to construct a new cabin with a roof thick enough to hold heat through an entire night without fire. He described his plan to Robert Hutchins over coffee one morning in June. The roof would be built in multiple layers. Total thickness would be 30 to 36 inches. The walls would need reinforcement to carry weight far beyond standard construction. The project would take months instead of days. Robert stared at him. "You're going to build a roof 3 feet thick? Elijah, that's madness. The weight alone will collapse your walls within a year." Elijah had anticipated this reaction. He pulled out calculations he had scratched onto a piece of bark. He had estimated the weight of wet sod, compressed earth, and timber. He had calculated how much weight his reinforced walls could support based on the diameter of logs he planned to use. The numbers showed it would work, but Robert was not convinced by scratches on bark. Word spread through the settlement. By the end of June, everyone knew about Elijah's plan. The reaction was universal skepticism mixed with amusement. Jacob Penrose, the settlement's most experienced carpenter, stopped by Elijah's building site to examine the foundation. He watched Elijah fitting logs. Together with obsessive precision, saw the thickness of the timber he was using, noticed the spacing of the vertical support posts. Jacob shook his head. "You're building a fortress to hold up a haystack. This is 3 months of work for something that should take 1 week." The nickname started that afternoon. Robert began calling it Carmichael's Haystack. Within days, everyone in the settlement used the phrase. Children asked their parents if they could go watch the man building the haystack. Women mentioned it while trading recipes and news. The name was not meant with cruelty, but it carried clear judgment. Elijah was wasting time and materials on an absurd experiment. Other criticism focused on practical concerns. Luther Green pointed out that moisture in a thick earthen roof would rot the underlying logs within 2 years. Sarah Hutchins questioned why anyone would invest months building a cabin when simpler construction had served mountain families for generations. Even Abigail, Daniel's widow, gently suggested that Elijah was letting grief drive him toward an impractical obsession. Elijah listened to all of it and continued working. He had made his calculations. He had studied what worked in nature and in other building traditions. He understood the skepticism, but he also understood something his neighbors did not. Every family in Clear Creek Valley lived one dead fire away from freezing to death. They accepted this risk because they knew no alternative. Elijah was building an alternative. If it failed, he would have wasted 4 months and looked foolish. If it succeeded, he would have solved the most dangerous problem of mountain winter survival. The trade-off seemed obvious. He kept building. Elijah began construction in early July of 1842. He selected a building site on high ground, 50 yards from the creek, with clear sight lines in all directions and natural drainage away from the foundation. The location made hauling water more difficult, but it kept the structure above potential flooding and provided visibility if threats approached. The walls came first. Standard cabin construction used whatever logs were available, notched quickly at corners, stacked with minimal fitting. Elijah rejected this approach entirely. He spent 2 weeks cutting and hauling logs from specific trees he had selected based on straightness and uniform diameter. He wanted logs approximately 14 inches across, significantly thicker than the 8 to 10-inch logs most cabins used. The extra diameter provided more bearing surface for the massive roof weight he planned to place on them. He stripped every log completely using a draw knife, removing all bark and shaping the contact surfaces until they fitted together with gaps no wider than a quarter inch. The process was backbreaking. Each log required 4 to 6 hours of work. Robert Hutchins stopped by one afternoon and watched Elijah shaping a log with meticulous care. "You know, that bark provides extra insulation," Robert said. Elijah explained that bark created irregular gaps that could not be properly chinked, and that stripped logs of consistent diameter could be fitted tight enough to make the gaps irrelevant. Robert left shaking his head. The chinking mixture took 3 days to prepare. Elijah mixed clay from the creek bank with dried moss and pine resin he had boiled down from sap collected in spring. The ratio was critical. Too much clay, and the mixture would crack as it dried. Too much resin, and it would remain tacky and attract dirt. He tested small batches, letting them dry and observing how they performed. The final mixture was 1 part resin to 3 parts clay with enough moss fiber to reinforce the structure. When applied between logs and allowed to dry, it created a seal that was flexible, waterproof, and incredibly strong. The walls rose slowly through July and into August. Where an experienced carpenter could raise cabin walls in 3 days, Elijah took 6 weeks. Each log was positioned, checked for level, adjusted, then secured with wooden pegs driven through pre-drilled holes, connecting it to the logs above and below. The chinking was applied in layers, packed tight, smoothed, allowed to dry before the next log went on top. By late August, the walls stood complete. They were 7 feet tall at the lowest point, 8 feet at the peak where the roof would ridge. The structure looked massively overbuilt compared to neighboring cabins. The logs were thicker. The corners were reinforced with additional vertical posts. The entire construction radiated solidity and weight. Elijah had built walls that could support a roof 3 times heavier than anything used in standard frontier construction. Now he had to build that roof. Late August brought the most critical phase of construction. Elijah began building the roof that would define his entire innovation. He started with the structural foundation, ridge poles spanning the width of the cabin. These were not branches or thin poles like standard construction. They were carefully selected logs, 8 inches in diameter, notched to sit securely on the top wall logs. He spaced them 12 inches apart instead of the standard 24 inches. The closer spacing distributed weight more evenly and prevented sagging under the massive load he planned to place above them. Across the ridge poles, he laid split planks hewn flat on one side. He had spent 2 weeks in early August splitting these planks from straight-grained pine. Each plank was 3 inches thick, fitted so tightly against its neighbors that daylight could not pass between them. He pegged each plank to the ridge poles using wooden pegs he had whittled during evening hours. This created a solid wooden deck that would support everything above while preventing any material from falling through into the living space below. The layering began in early September. First layer, 8 inches of dried thatch and grass, compressed by walking on it repeatedly until it formed a dense mat. This layer created dead air space, the primary insulation that would prevent heat from escaping upward. Elijah had cut the grass in July and let it dry for 6 weeks. He laid it in overlapping bundles, compressing each section before adding the next. Second layer, 6 inches of clay, mixed with chopped straw. He had prepared this mixture in large batches, keeping it damp and workable under wet burlap. He spread it across the thatch layer with a wooden paddle, working in sections, packing it down, smoothing the surface. As it dried over the following 2 weeks, it formed a solid mass that added weight and created an air barrier, preventing moisture from moving up or down through the roof structure. Third layer, 12 inches of sod cut from the hillside. Elijah had spent 3 days cutting rectangular sections of sod approximately 2 feet long and 1 foot wide. He laid them grass side up, roots intact, fitting them together like stones in a wall. The roots would continue growing, binding the sections together and creating a living roof that would repair itself over time. Fourth layer, loose thatch that he laid over the sod and allowed to drape down over the edges. This gave the roof its shaggy, irregular appearance. The thatch provided additional weather protection and allowed the roof to breathe, letting moisture escape gradually without creating rot in the lower layers. By the end of September, the roof was complete. It stood nearly 3 feet tall at the ridge. It weighed approximately 4 tons. It looked absolutely absurd. Jacob Penrose walked around it twice, examining the structure from every angle, and finally admitted that the walls were holding the weight, though he still believed the entire thing would collapse during the first heavy snow. Elijah moved into his completed cabin in early November of 1842. He had spent the final weeks of October finishing interior details, building a sleeping platform, constructing shelves, installing a small table. He built a stone fireplace in one corner with a narrow chimney that extended above the roofline. The chimney opening was smaller than standard construction, only 8 inches across instead of the typical 12 to 14 inches. He needed minimal draft because he planned to burn minimal fire. The first truly cold night came on November 18th. Temperature dropped to 26 degrees by evening. Elijah built a fire at 6 o'clock. He used seasoned oak, a slow-burning wood that produced steady heat. By 8 o'clock, the cabin interior had reached 68 degrees. He could feel warmth radiating from the ceiling as the massive roof absorbed heat rising from the fire. By 10 o'clock, the cabin was nearly 70 degrees. Elijah let the fire die completely and went to sleep. He woke at 6 in the morning. The fire had been dead for 8 hours. He immediately checked his thermometer. The cabin was 58 degrees. Outside temperature was 23 degrees. His cabin was 35 degrees warmer than the exterior, and he had not maintained any fire through the night. The roof had absorbed heat during the evening and released it slowly throughout the night, acting exactly as he had theorized it would. Over the next week, Elijah experimented with fire schedules. He discovered that 3 hours of fire in the evening kept the cabin comfortable through the entire night. He tried burning fire for only 2 hours. The cabin stayed above 50 degrees until morning. He tried 4 hours of fire and woke uncomfortably warm at 65 degrees. 3 to 4 hours was optimal. In early December, he walked to Robert Hutchins's cabin to compare conditions. Robert's fire had burned continuously through the previous night. Robert admitted he had woken 3 times to add wood. His cabin interior was 42 degrees that morning. Elijah's cabin, with no fire burning since 10 the previous evening, was 58 degrees. The difference was 16 degrees. Robert stood in Elijah's cabin, feeling the residual warmth, and struggled to understand how it was possible. By late December, Elijah had established a routine. He built a fire around 6 each evening while preparing his meal. The fire burned while he ate and completed evening tasks. By 10, he let it die. He slept through the night without waking. By morning, the cabin remained comfortable enough that he could dress and begin his day without immediately rebuilding the fire. He often waited until evening to light the next fire, going 24 hours between burns. He tracked his firewood consumption. By the end of December, he had burned through approximately 1/8 of a cord. At this rate, he would use less than half a cord for the entire winter. His neighbors were burning 2 to 3 cords over the same period. January of 1843 brought the coldest weather Clear Creek Valley had experienced in 15 years. A high-pressure system settled over the Appalachian Mountains and refused to move. Temperatures dropped and stayed down. On January 12th, the exterior temperature reached 9 degrees below zero. It stayed below zero for 3 consecutive days and nights. In the settlement, families burned through firewood stockpiles at alarming rates. Robert Hutchins later admitted he burned half a cord in those 3 days alone, feeding his fire constantly just to keep his cabin at 40 degrees. His children huddled under every blanket the family owned. Sarah Hutchins slept in her coat. Robert himself woke every 90 minutes throughout each night to add wood, terrified of letting the fire die. Luther Green's cabin suffered structural failure on the second night. His roof, built using standard construction with a thin layer of sod over bark and poles, could not support the combined weight of 3 feet of snow that had fallen in December, plus the ice that had formed from freeze-thaw cycles. The ridgepole cracked at 2 in the morning with a sound like a gunshot. Luther, his wife, and their 3 children grabbed what they could and fled into the night. They walked through 9 below zero cold to Jacob Penrose's cabin and crowded into his already small space. Luther's family survived, but they lost their home and most of their possessions. On the morning of January 14th, the third day of extreme cold, settlers emerged from their cabins exhausted. Most had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch for 3 nights. Firewood supplies were critically low. Several families faced the possibility of running out entirely if the cold continued. There was talk of combining families into fewer cabins to conserve wood and share fire-tending duties. That morning, Robert Hutchins walked past Elijah's cabin and saw something that stopped him completely. Steam was rising from Elijah's chimney, not the thick gray smoke of a roaring fire, but thin wisps of vapor. Robert approached and knocked. Elijah opened the door, wearing only a shirt and trousers. The interior of the cabin was warm. Robert stepped inside and felt the difference immediately. His own cabin that morning had been 38 degrees despite a fire that had burned all night. Elijah's cabin was 55 degrees, and Elijah explained his fire had gone out at 10 the previous evening. Robert stood in the warmth and felt something close to anger. His family had suffered for 3 days. His children had cried from the cold. He had burned half a cord of precious firewood. And 50 yards away, Elijah had slept comfortably through each night without maintaining any fire at all. The absurd roof, the haystack everyone had mocked, had kept Elijah 25 degrees warmer than everyone else. The difference was not trivial or interesting. It was the difference between suffering and comfort, between survival and potential death. Spring of 1843 arrived with mud and melting snow. Families assessed the damage from the brutal winter. Luther Green began rebuilding his collapsed cabin using borrowed materials. Several families had exhausted their firewood supplies and spent the final weeks of winter burning furniture and fence rails. 2 elderly settlers had died during the cold snap, though whether from the cold itself or simply from age was unclear. Robert Hutchins approached Elijah in late March with a direct question. Would Elijah help him build a thermal roof on his existing cabin? Robert could not afford to build an entirely new structure, but he wanted to replace his failed roof with something that would protect his family the following winter. Elijah agreed. The project took 3 months. They removed Robert's existing roof completely, exposing the interior to spring weather. They reinforced the wall tops with additional logs to create better bearing surfaces. They built the ridgepole framework with the same close spacing Elijah had used. Then they began the layering process: planks, compressed thatch, clay and straw mixture, sod, and finally the loose thatch that gave the roof its characteristic shaggy appearance. Robert's neighbors watched the construction with the same skepticism they had shown Elijah the previous year. But this time, 2 families asked detailed questions. By summer's end, 3 cabins in Clear Creek Valley had thermal mass roofs in various stages of construction. The technique was spreading, though slowly. Most families still considered the time investment excessive. Winter of 1843 to 1844 was milder than the previous year, but cold enough to provide a fair test. Robert Hutchins experienced what Elijah had discovered. 3 to 4 hours of evening fire kept his cabin comfortable through the night. His firewood consumption dropped by more than half. More importantly, his family slept through entire nights without waking to tend fire. Sarah Hutchins told other women in the settlement about this change. The ability to sleep uninterrupted through winter nights was, for the mothers and wives, perhaps more valuable than the firewood savings. By 1845, 7 families had built thermal roofs. Jacob Penrose, who had initially mocked the design, quietly studied Elijah's construction methods and began incorporating thermal mass principles into other building projects. He built a spring house using thick stone walls that kept milk and butter cool through summer. He constructed a smokehouse with a thick earthen roof that maintained consistent temperature for curing meat. The innovation spread through demonstrated results rather than promotion. Families who adopted the technique survived winters more comfortably and more safely than those who did not. The phrase "sleeping without a fire" became shorthand in the settlement. When someone mentioned they had slept without a fire, everyone understood they meant sleeping through the night while the fire was dead, waking warm rather than freezing, living without the constant anxiety that defined standard mountain winter existence. By 1848, roughly half the families in Clear Creek Valley had built some version of the thermal roof. Elijah Carmichael never sought recognition for his innovation. He never traveled to other settlements promoting the technique. He never wrote down instructions or created diagrams. He simply lived in his cabin and answered questions from anyone who asked. When neighbors needed help building their own thermal roofs, he provided guidance freely. The knowledge spread organically because it solved a problem that killed people. By the 1850s, variations of the thermal mass roof appeared throughout the Appalachian mountain settlements. Each adaptation reflected local materials and individual skill levels. Some builders used stone instead of sod for the outer layer. Others incorporated different thatch materials based on what grew locally. A few experimented with clay mixtures that included different binding agents. The specific details varied, but the core principle remained constant. Build enough mass into the roof to absorb and hold heat through an entire night. Historians who later studied frontier construction methods estimated that the thermal roof technique reduced winter firewood consumption by 70 to 80% in cabins that used it. More significantly, it eliminated deaths from fires going out during extreme cold. Between 1843 and 1865, no recorded deaths from nighttime cold occurred in cabins built with thermal mass roofs in the Clear Creek Valley settlement or surrounding areas. The innovation did not eliminate all winter dangers, but it removed one of the most common and most preventable causes of frontier death. Elijah lived in his original cabin until 1867, 25 years after building it. The roof remained structurally sound throughout that period. The living sod continued growing and repairing itself. The clay layers never cracked significantly. The thatch compressed over time, but maintained its insulating properties. When Elijah moved to live with his daughter's family in a newer settlement, the cabin was immediately occupied by a young couple just arrived from Virginia. They lived in it for another 15 years. The broader lesson of Elijah's innovation was not about roofs specifically. It was about the relationship between engineering and survival. Most frontier deaths resulted from accepting standard methods without questioning whether better approaches existed. Elijah had questioned a fundamental assumption that cabins must be built quickly, using minimal materials. He had proven that investing more time and thought into construction created structures that were safer, more comfortable, and more durable. The innovation also demonstrated that frontier problems could be solved using local materials and basic tools. Elijah had not imported expensive supplies or relied on specialized knowledge. He had used grass, clay, sod, and timber available within walking distance of his building site. His tools were a draw knife, an axe, and a saw. The sophistication was in how he combined simple materials and basic tools to achieve results that seemed impossible under standard construction methods. Elijah Carmichael died in 1871 at the age of 63. He was buried in a small cemetery outside the settlement he had helped establish. His gravestone listed his name and dates but made no mention of the innovation that had defined his legacy.